Hey moms, looking for some lighthearted guidance on this crazy journey we call parenting?
Join me, Sabrina Kohlberg,
And me, Andy Mitchell, for Pop Culture Moms,
where each week we talk about what we're watching
and examine our favorite pop culture moms up close to try to pick up some parenting hacks along the way.
Come laugh, learn, and grow with us as we look for the best tips.
And maybe a few what not to do's from our favorite fictional moms.
From Good Morning America and ABC Audio.
Pop Culture Moms. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, everyone. Patrick here, cutting in before the actual episode to tell everyone that this is an interview episode where I sat down with none other than filmmaker Chase Joynt to talk about his excellent new book, Vantage Points, which just came out, so about a month and a half ago by the time this comes out. And the book takes up the surprising appearance of Marshall McLuhan, famous father of media studies, in Chase's family archive as a way to think about all kinds of things, such as the legacies of childhood sexual abuse and how we might process and represent such events through a series of vignettes that really places the memoir form in the context of other sources, media, and stories to create this eclectic and really fascinating montage-like experience of reading. For those of you who don't know, Chase himself is a director and writer whose films have won more than 25 jury and audience awards all across the world. And his latest documentary feature, which is called Framing Agnes, actually premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, where it won the Next Innovator Award and the Next Audience Award. But Chase is also the author of the Lambda Literary Award finalist, You Only Live Twice, which was co-authored with Mike Holboom, and Boys Don't Cry, which was co-authored by Morgan M. Page. So I really encourage you to check out his work, and especially Vantage Points, which I really, really appreciated as a read. And I really appreciated this interview. So enjoy this and let me know if you want anything like this in the future. All right, on to the show. Chase, thank you very much for joining us to talk about your brand new book, or relatively new book. It came out a month and a half ago, I think, from the moment of this recording. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
And second of all, just to kind of introduce us to the topic, do you mind telling us a little bit about what exactly Vantage Points is as a book, and just to give listeners a little bit of an insight into what discussion we're going to have today?
Sure, absolutely. And I'm very happy to be speaking with you. While it's true it's been out in the world for a month, I still feel very new to having to summarize it in this way. So I'm appreciative of the opportunity. And there's many ways that you could describe what Vantage Points is, but perhaps the starting point is that after the death of my mother's father, a box of his belongings arrived to our family home. And as my mom and I were sorting through it, I recognized a connection in the archival material to the Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan. And as someone who has a PhD in cinema and media studies and who has lived and worked in Canadian contexts, I was immediately enlivened in a very dorky way by the potentials of this connection. And it was through really doubling down on McLuhan that I was able to unlock other much more difficult histories and pasts that were also inside that box. And so it becomes a collision of media theory and personal writing about intergenerational trauma and violence and masculinity.
And before we get into the actual content of the book, this just occurred to me, like, as you mentioned, you have a background in cinema, right? And you have produced many films as a filmmaker. Did you find that transition towards a more literary or more written perspective to be rather difficult, or was it something that arrived pretty naturally to you as a kind of storytelling technique?
You know, I can share a brief anecdote, which is that early on in the writing, I shared a draft of the project with someone, and they came back with a little bit of a I know no one can see us, but a kind of like WTF emoji with their hands up. And I was like, oh no, this is not the reaction that I wanted to inspire with this project. And granted, it was years ago. But one of the things that was revealed to me in that conversation was that I was trying to treat, in some ways, the book like a film and trying to think visually as a writing practice and as a writing style. And so one of the things that I say early on in the project is I'm actually thinking on the page about montage, about radical juxtaposition. And I think trying to set up the reader with those expectations in the beginning releases a little bit of the pressure and I hope offers a little bit of permission to be more experimental on the page. So very much I feel like the book is in line with my moving image practice, but of course offers a whole new set of problems and possibilities.
And that's one of the things that you address in the book, sometimes implicitly rather than explicitly, but different media offers different possibilities by very definition, right? That was McLuhan's whole point. You kind of elaborate on that in new and exciting ways. But yeah, I would hope that that's what actually came out of it. But I think you succeeded in that transition between different medias very well. I really appreciated your writing style and your, as you say, media montage, which we'll get to in a little bit. But I do want to come back to McLuhan since he does feature prominently in your book, even when you don't mention him by name. So can you explain a little bit why his theory specifically informed a lot of your book? Because you do mention a family connection, and I hope to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. But theoretically speaking, as the father of media studies, you do take a lot from him. And I was curious, like, how you thought through that and how you formed these connections between his theories and the exploration of gender and masculinity that you have in the book.
I love this, and really, this conversation is already really appealing to my geekiest places and my geekiest mind. There's a few things if I want to take literally your question of what am I taking from McLuhan. I'm taking a lot of structure. I'm taking a lot of his formal moves. So one of the things that Vantage Points is doing is thinking directly about McLuhan's book, Understanding Media, which is a giant book, 400 pages, and the chapters are structured each about different technologies. So you have a chapter on film, you have a chapter on television, you have a chapter on the radio. And I lift and borrow a set of those chapter headings as the way in which to organize some of my storytelling. But then that's only the first layer of McLuhan that exists formally. The second is that the trim size, so the literal size of the book and the relation between the words on the page and images and graphics is really in conversation with McLuhan's probably most famous book, The Medium is the Massage. And so if you are to take those two books together and literally look at their trim, look at their feel, look at their paper, there is a kind of conversation being had formally there as well. Now, it's not to say that anything about what's in my book is really related to what's in McLuhan's book, but if we're thinking about the medium is the message, which is, I'm sure, something we'll talk about more together, what does it mean to think about the structure as the book, the structure of the story as the book, the structure of the book as the way in which we are reckoning with these pasts and with these histories, and like, what is the book actually doing, And I'm really interested in that question. And that's perhaps the filmmaker in me coming through again. But, McLuhan is a very contested figure in media history. And one of the reasons why I felt comfortable playing in the world of McLuhan is precisely because there is so much written about him. There are so many interesting and incisive critiques that I was able to actually take all of that into consideration rather than trying to uphold him as some kind of figure that cannot be knocked off a pedestal. And it's through those writings. So, for example, one thing I'm thinking about is I think it was Douglas Copeland who said, McLuhan reminds us that, artists are the greatest interpreters of our times. And I was like, okay, great. I'm going to take that as permission, and I'm going to identify myself as an artist here, and I'm going to keep going. And so where were those moments of permission that I could really wrap a story around?
There's a few things that I want to grab onto here, even though they weren't formal questions that I had sent you. But first of all, I really like the comment that you made on the actual format of the book and the way it was printed, because I read a digital copy. I read an advanced copy that was sent to me many, many months ago, and it's only now that we're getting around to this. But so knowing that the physical copy, as you're talking about, is meant deliberately to be a play off of the medium as the message, or message, or mass age, depending on how you kind of want to think about it. But it adds a dimension to this book that I feel really shines through. And I'm wondering if that's something that you were thinking of when you were producing the book, like how would it translate in its digital form, right? Is it something that came to mind, or were you thinking purely in its physicality as a published text, which is an increasing rarity in today's world in many ways, but still offers possibilities, like you're saying, for interesting media play?
Yeah, absolutely. It was definitely on my mind. And it was also a really important part of the conversations that I was having with my agent as we were approaching publishers, which was to say, we need to find a publisher who, not to be trite, but says yes and to the project, not yes but. And the yes and is about the specificities of the book as object, about what it would mean to collaborate with a designer, what it would mean to have to think across an audiobook for a book of this kind. And so I'm really compelled and interested in the fact that you read a digital copy, and it's coming on the tails of my finishing the audiobook. And I'm going to put both of those things together, which is to say, whoa, do they reveal things that the book cannot? Which is to say, how do you make a project that is hyper visual an audio experience for someone? And how do you, perhaps even more importantly, not reduce all of the possibilities for associative meaning making by over explaining everything that's happening? It was like my worst nightmare to have to describe images and graphics. And then I was like, whoa, well, that's my own limitation, actually. Like, if I think about folks who are listening and who are not reading or who can't read, like, as if I should not be able to find a way to do this that can keep open the possibilities for that connection making. And so each of these forms became new challenges. And I think, the digital copy, while I understand is an incredible mode of accessibility and means folks can be reading it quicker and faster and in multiple places, I think a lot about the materiality of the page and the texture and the feel and what it looks like to have to crack a spine open or to mark a page. And I don't know how to do that in the digital form. And I am so interested and curious to learn more from folks who feel like they've unlocked something in that space, because I'm not sure. And perhaps in the work that you're doing, you might have a better answer than me. But there are parts of the question or parts of the work that are untranslatable in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it, as a digital book consumer in this very particular instance, I'll probably get a physical copy of the book now that I know this. But
I'm going to send you one at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But what drew my attention rather is the way that the page was actually set out, right? So like the text on the page, that was still something that translated in the digital format. But you're right, the materiality of the paper and the format is something that I think is getting more and more play in the way that the average person talks about a text. But still, it is something that's unrepresented, or underrepresented, I should say, overall. And yeah, very, very interesting. Anyway, so I wanted to move on to another thing that you had mentioned, and that is kind of McLuhan's godlike status in many ways as a media figure, to the point where I had taken many classes. One elective that comes to mind was when I took a hip hop class, which was fun. But the teacher would just kind of launch these McLuhan quotes into the class and kind of pepper them throughout without actually engaging with them critically, as if they were just fact, right? Which to an undergrad, as I was at the time, was fine. I didn't think about it more than it needed to. But it does get to the heart of your point. And one of the things that your book does is offer some form of criticism of McLuhan, right? Especially in his approach to masculinity, right? Or from a feminist perspective. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit as to what you're doing. I know this question was planned a little bit later, but I think it's a good place to mention it because of your previous answer. So If you could elaborate a little bit on some of your critiques of McLuhan, I think this would be a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to follow your flow wherever you want to go. So, you're absolutely right. And I really appreciate you reading the book in that way, because I will admit one of my early hesitations in thinking about using McLuhan in this way was like, oh God, am I going to be one of those people who like upholds McLuhan in this way uncomplicatedly? And there is such a cult-like following around McLuhan. And one of the things that I say in the book is that in some ways the cult-like following reproduces the problems of the original text. But there is a cohort of totally radical and transformative feminist scholars who understand McLuhan's theories as deeply flawed and yet very useful. And so one of the things that they say is, while McLuhan wasn't able to think about sexism and racism and misogyny and was really limited in his capacity to understand difference, he did understand technology as a structuring form of power. And structuring forms of power are critical to all feminist thought. And so how can we take that and rearrange it together? And so for as much as I'm using McLuhan as a source material, I'm also using a book co-edited by someone named Sarah Sharma, who's at the University of Toronto, called Re-Understanding Media, which is the feminist critique of the book that I'm using. And I will say it often to as many people as will listen. Re-understanding media is the more important text than understanding media, even while I borrow from McLuhan's sort of structuring styles, right? Like it's actually the critiques that gave me the permission to stay in place and to think about what was of use there.
And that again delves into another question that that I had planned for. It's almost as if I had pre-planned a lot of these in an interesting way. But yeah, obviously one of the ways that you address the topics and structure of this book is the way in which media becomes a metaphor for all kinds of aspects of our lives, right? Gender is the major one, but you can also include trauma and so on. And one of the elements that really popped out to me, or one of the quotes, was that old masculinities become the content of new masculinities, which I think is a really potent way for you to kind of get at the heart of how gender is structured in many ways by media, with the specific use of content in this case, which is a particularly loaded term in the 21st century, I feel, for good or bad. But I was wondering if you could explain a little bit how you see these metaphors as operating, right? Like how can you explain it to perhaps a layman who's not necessarily familiar with how McLuhan's work operates, or how you're perhaps influenced by media studies in that sense? How can media possibly influence things like gender, right? Or media forms?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a great way to start, I think, which is to say early in McLuhan's writing, he says something, and I'm paraphrasing, but he's like, we can track how speeches become books and books transform into movies. And it's in the look back that we can see how speeches function, how books function, right? Like it's like actually as the technology transforms that we have an opportunity to create new perspective. But it's only having moved through. It's very difficult to do in the center of or in the middle of. And this is part of the numbing effect that McLuhan continues to return to. It's kind of like I like to think about that very terrible way in which people use the scene of frogs in boiling water, that if you slowly increase the temperature, frogs don't know to escape. And I'm like, oh, we need to get the frogs out of that pot and also out of that storytelling. But it's true of media, and I've never done this before, and this might be the last time I put frogs into a conversation. But this is what McLuhan is arguing about media as well, is that when we are inundated and overwhelmed and consumed, we actually cannot make sense of our sensorial realities. And so one of the sort of central conceits of Vantage Points is to say, what if the medium is masculinity, as an open question? Even though it probably will break down, what if we just take it as an idea for a second, as an experiment? And so if we think about how speeches are transformed into books, which are transformed into movies, and then we look back and we get to see what speeches were really about, how do we think about grandfathers and fathers and sons and the kind of intergenerational transmissions of knowledge and content to your point, what happens at the look back. And so something about Vantage Points for me is about that look back to my grandfather. It's about that look back to the ways in which masculinity is shaped and formed through this kind of transmission. And I think, we could think about it as adaptation in the language of media, things that are adapted. And I think that's true of familial structures. I think that for many of us who are queer and trans, we take oppositional stances in many ways to the gendered forms of rearing that we survived, right? And instead of being oppositional, my hope is that the book is slightly more complicated in its orientation, where it understands that to oppose is actually to deny similarity, and there's a lot at risk and at stake in that sort of separation.
I had framed this as a question originally, but I think I'll kind of make it as a comment. And if you have anything you wanted to add on to it, that this very much fits in with the media montage element of your book, right? Where you connect. I'll take off the top of my head, right? You have a chapter that's titled "Skin Housing," if I remember correctly, or is it "Housing Skin"? Right. So how the way we construct literally the institutions that we live in, right, are kind of extensions or can be of our periphery, of our skin periphery in a sense. And each chapter flows into the other, right, through the forms of media that you address, and very much informs one another, right, by expanding on different types of media and reconsidering what media is concretely, right? Because I think very few people would consider, like you're saying, masculinity as a form of media, or skin, right, as a form of media, and yet they inform the way we talk about the world as a media should, or as a form of media should, I should say.
Yes.
So yeah, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add on to that, but I do think the structure itself of the book and the way you wrote the book does lend itself to what you're saying, right? And even if you want to add on to that, the familial connection that you're talking about, where you start with a box, full of your grandfather's stuff, which is just a bunch of media detritus, if you want to put it that way. Yes. I don't know how you would frame it. That's probably a bad term, but
no, it's great.
Right. Okay. But yeah, I think all of these connections are present, at least in my mind. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add on to that, but I think that's a helpful way for me to think about it.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that reading. And, I think one of the things that Montage opens up in the book is permission to be nonlinear, to permission to be fragmented, permission to be associative. Because if we're thinking about memory, which is foundational to any kind of archival pursuit, and we're thinking about trauma, they are fragmented and distorted processes of remembering and therefore reconstructing. And so to me, I don't even know how I would go about writing something like this in some kind of linear fashion and or as a narrative that moved from a beginning to a middle to an end. It's so much more circular and circuitous and rhizomatic that the form has to represent and or at least be in conversation with the internal processes. And, I think that it would be impossible in some ways to create a project like this without that kind of form. It really is a kind of media as the, medium is the message moment, where Montage unlocks the possibilities of a more cohesive whole.
Absolutely. And that's something that I noted as well when you were talking about fragmentation, right? Is that you very much revel at times in some of the contradictions of the media that you're engaging with, right? Or the very text that you're creating. Sometimes in pulling from various thinkers, right? You also pull from Roland Barthes, for example, or like you were saying, feminist critiques in re-understanding media. And you're kind of creating this Frankenstein monster of or the Frankenstein's creature, to put it more less derogatory.
I'm not afraid of the monster.
Yeah, exactly. I have this conversation way too often with people, but I'm curious, like one of the things that you hear often in writing or in the way that people think through media criticism is that you have to come to some kind of conclusion at some point, right? You try to make a point, whether it's in academic writing or just writing in general. And I'm wondering, do you have an end in sight whenever you're kind of playing with these contradictions, or is it for you a constant project of breaking down and reestablishing with no actual end in sight, which I think can be a valid project in and of itself, but I'm just curious, like, how you think about it.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I think one of the things when you say contradiction, one of the things I think about all the time as it relates to this project is that two things can be true at the same time, which is its own form of contradiction, right? And it's not that one is true and one is false, or one is good or one is bad, but there's a kind of concurrency to the project that, when put together, I think creates new meaning. And so, of course, it's related to our previous conversation about montage. And, you know, this book took me a very long time to finish. And in part, that's because of the difficulty of its emotional undertones and its context within my family, and, you know, the ongoing work that I, for example, wanted to do with my mom around, like, what would it mean to put any part of our family, and more particularly her family, into the world in this way, even while it is rigorously anonymized and it's not remotely interested in kind of disclosure for disclosure's sake. It's still personal. And, you know, it connects me to your question about conclusion, because for a long time I had no idea where it was going. And as a result, it felt a little bit flat, like it could have gone on forever in a way that was weird. And in a way that I actually think some people might critique McLuhan for. You know, he just
Yeah.
goes on and on and on and on about things. And so what it looked like was having a number of these chapters built, and then actually starting to delete some of the chapters, to trash them. And the reason why they were put in the bin was because they didn't rightfully integrate into the personal history with enough precision to merit their inclusion. They were a little bit, they were on a tangent. They were maybe about gender, but they weren't about me. They were maybe about media, but they weren't about masculinity. Like, there were all these missing pieces. And so it was a process of elimination. So once I removed all those chapters, then I thought, well, now I need to link these all a little bit more. And I really appreciate your comment about how the chapters unlock the rest, because wow, was that like a long process of figuring out how do you move from this to that in a way that doesn't feel cheap, you know,
Yeah.
and doesn't, and then I'll just say, as a final sort of answer to your question, there was a moment where the book ended with a letter to my mom. And now it ends with a letter to the sort of central anonymized figure in the book, someone who's named Uncle X. And the letter to my mom was an interesting moment, but I realized, like, well, that's actually just called the acknowledgments. Like, I don't know that it actually needs to be a part of the book. And maybe that's actually not what I'm doing. And it was actually through other people reading the book and saying, this is not for your mom in this way. Like, sure it is, but that's just because you love her. It's not actually what the book is doing. And I really appreciated that moment to reconsider.
I'm curious, like, how much of this project, in actually cutting out all of this stuff, right? How much of that forced you to reconsider, right, what the project was actually about? Like, did you still have, did you have from the start a clear vision of what it was about, or in cutting, was it also a way for you to like reconsider what fundamentally you were doing? Does that make
Yeah,
sense? I don't know if that question makes sense.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I was reconsidering until the very end.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that's where I gain a lot of momentum, is in foundational commitments to form. So there were a few things that I had settled, right? This is going to be the structure of the book. This is the way it's going to work. And from that point, what can we do here? So I wasn't going to throw out my central conceit of like moving through technologies as a way in which to link familial archive with media theory and personal writing. And so I knew all of those component parts, but just like any, you know, chef in a kitchen, you put those ingredients in the wrong way and things get weird. And so you have to sort of keep experimenting with their arrangements. And that was true right up until the end, because the last component part of the book was layout and design. And it significantly impacts the reading experience. So much so that different design choices that we were making disrupted the argument of the chapter, and we needed to completely strip it away and recompose the pages to make sure that the reader was able to follow and bring a connection from one page to the next or from one section to the next.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's not something that you necessarily think about. I don't know, speaking from a reader's perspective, it's not necessarily something you consider as you're reading, right? The work that goes into, like you say, the form or structure of the text, um, and it is destabilizing as a reader at points, and I think it's obviously meant to be. In many ways, where when I first started reading, I was like, what's the point here? We're talking about a lot of different things. And I don't mean this in a negative way. I think it's good to be destabilized and kind of postmodern in that sense, right? Where you're not quite sure where we're going to zig when we're zagging and all of that. But by the end, in the last like couple of chapters, segments, however you want to call them, it all comes together in a way that invites a rereading, right? With that in mind. And I think that's where the attention to form really shines through, because it makes you reconsider the entire book as a form.
Thank you.
Which, again, bravo on that one. 10 out of 10.
Thank you.
No
That's a very
notes.
meaningful compliment to me, I will say. That is that you are my, ideal reader. Thank you.
Getting into a little bit more of the abstract questions here. So we've been referring to McLuhan more theoretically. And one of the elements that is central to your book is a family connection, right? That you make with McLuhan. And that connection is never one that's quite resolved, at least not in the conventional sense, in the sense that you're sure whether or not that connection or how that connection actually played out, right? Or at least it's left kind of speculative. And I'm curious how much the speculative is something that was in the back of your mind as you were writing this, especially in relation to the purely factual, which tends to be how memoirs, which is, formalistically what your book wants to be in many ways, right? Is a memoir, but right, often it's framed in a factual way, right? So how do you kind of bridge that speculative and factual in writing or in creating a text like this? I don't know again if this question makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. And I think that there's two different ways to answer it. So
Okay.
one is McLuhan based and one is
Mhm.
much more broad and is related to my filmmaking practice. And so, in many of my films, I am reckoning with trans history, and to reckon with trans history is actually to reckon with a lack. It is looking back at histories where people do not exist, where traces are missing, where things are coded and recoded for safety, for reasons of safety, for reasons of violence and omission. And so all grappling with trans history, in my opinion and experience, is a form of careful speculation. And that does not mean that it is not fact-based. That does not mean that it is not rigorously researched, but there are limits. And we can think about all of the ways that, colonial and institutional archives are also continually rewriting the access that we have to people and community histories. So this is the foundation of my thinking, period. And I'm thinking about the work of someone like Saidiya Hartman, who's writing about the missing narratives of enslaved women and girls, and who is writing in a creative, fabulated form toward these histories, not to, quote, make them up, but to think about this very precise and specific historical lack. And obviously my project is not the same as Hartman's, but I think it is in thinking with folks who are doing that kind of work. And there's so much about our families and our family archives that we will never know, and that are coded in all kinds of reasons that we will never understand. And there's something about McLuhan's work that offered me a kind of permission. And part of the reason for that is because he claims, and those who theorize him claim, that his main goal was not a cohesive media theory by any means, but was to reach for connections. And I'm like, okay, I can do that. I can commit to reaching for connections. And some of those connections don't work, and they fail, but that's okay. I can commit to the process. And as a result, I was able to sort of slip in between, and to also stay true to some of the archival texts. Not that they are truths, but that they are material objects upon which I can do some interpretive work.
I'm constantly drawn to, I forget who made this claim. I'm going to butcher this so much, but I like the way that you frame it, where I remember a professor once saying of Shakespeare's histories, right? And there's a point here that I'm promising to make, where he referred to them as truth, not history. And the whole point of that comment was to say that what these texts do, specifically in Shakespeare, is get to the heart of what we imagine certain things to be, or what we want certain things to be, according to a specific frame of mind, right? Not whether or not, like you're saying, they're actual historical fact in the conventional sense, right? Because that can get very dicey whenever you look at it with any kind of critical eye. So I'm thinking of it in those senses, and I'm drawn also to the connection that you're making to other forms of post-colonial historiography that you were talking about, right? And I'm drawn to Leanne Simpson's term constellation of co-resistances, which I think is very much in line with one of the ways that you're thinking through some of the events and ideas in your text, right? Of reimagining the trans body or queer body as something that can be in co-resistance with all kinds of other elements in our daily lives, right? And I don't know if, again, you have anything you want to say or add to that, but that's just where my mind is going. And I kind of appreciate your comment for allowing me to make at least those connections.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing Simpson into the conversation here. And I really love, constellation as a word, as a formation, as an idea, as a conceptual opportunity is so relevant to Vantage points. And it makes me think a lot about how I understand transness, which is to say, don't cancel me, but I'm like, over the particular ways that we talk about transness as a contained identificatory position. I think transness is like much more expansive. Now, do I think trans and non-binary folks have material realities that need to be attended to? Absolutely, and without question. But in the realm of aesthetics and art, I think transness becomes a way to think about thresholds, and a way to think about boundaries, and a way to think about movement, and not necessarily movement from A to B, but movement more generally. And so the sort of coalition-based or constellation-based approach to me that you're bringing into the conversation is deeply rooted and or related to transness also as a method.
To bring it back again to the main thrust of the book, or at least the underlying thrust of the book, it gets to the heart of what McLuhan was going for with the medium is the message slash massage slash massage. I never know which one to use, because the whole point is that
you and me both.
Right. But the whole point is that it's a slippery term, right? It's a slippery concept that bleeds into itself, right? And doesn't want to be a firm category in that sense, right? But its lack of categorization is its own thing, contradictory as it may seem. So again, it all comes full circle, and yeah, I think your point is definitely well taken in that sense. Yeah, don't worry, no one's going to cancel you.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask a bit about some of the other elements that we've alluded to here and there, but not necessarily in great depth. So one of the things that you bring up in your book is a legacy of trauma and memory, right? Which you alluded to a little bit in some of your answers. So I'm curious as to why you decided that this was important to bring into relation with the rest of the ideas that you do in your text, right? The gender and masculinity stuff, or the media stuff. How do you see these as working in such an interesting way, and why do you feel it's important to bring up, especially in relation to the trans experience that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think we rightfully have hesitation when we think about how to talk about sexual and gender-based violence. And that becomes compounded and pressurized when thinking about it as it relates to the trans experience or to a trans experience, because we live in a culture that is still pathologizing and attempting to find root causes of sexual and gender difference. And so what happens when I say something like my masculinity is sculpted in some ways in relation to and or in opposition to other masculinities in my life? And therefore, right, what happens in that sort of, and therefore fill in the blank? That's very tricky territory. And I think that we've developed a way in which to speak about violence against women and girls, and we have developed a way in which to speak about misogyny and patriarchy and the forms of racism that inform those conversations. And then when you put some of those conversations alongside discourse about trans masculinity, it becomes very tricky. And so I'm trying to hang out in that trickiness, I guess, and this is my first attempt in this way. It's certainly not my first attempt in my life. I am steeped in this contradiction and this collision all the time. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in Vantage Points is to say precisely that I'm not the only one who's trying to hang out in this space. So I'm thinking about someone like Thomas Page McBee, who's a transmasculine author, who's sitting at the center of very difficult conversations about masculinity, about white masculinity in particular. And again, to be associative and to build a constellation, how can we prove that multiple people are asking these questions, and perhaps there's a bit of safety in understanding that there are many of us here?
I really like this idea of providing a safe space in a way, despite the problems, or not problems, the pushback that you're seeing a lot in society, right? From all kinds of spheres. And I'm wondering, like, is this something as the book was coming out or as it was approaching its final stages, or even as you were thinking of the book, is this reckoning with masculinity and transness, is this something that you were thinking of in relation to potential pushback that you might get? Because there's so much vitriol about this in society. I'm taking Canadian society as an example, but really in a lot of spaces as well. And is that potential pushback something that you considered as well, or were you just purely creating this with a more healthy, perhaps, view in mind?
I am far too anxious of a person to not consider the pushback from day one. I think in some ways, I just consider the pushback before I have the idea.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've learned through making movies is all of your work is a series of choices. All of your work is going to have limitations. You are always going to look back on your work and see things that you couldn't see at the time of its making. And in some ways, when thinking about trans experience, I hope that's true, because we're in trouble if we look back and work is not of a time and place. If we are still in that time and place 10 years later, we're in trouble, And I don't imagine myself to be different from anyone else who's asking these questions and taking these risks and is limited by my own experience and my own positionality. So one of the things that I try to consider, and one of the ways in which I try to reckon with the anxiety that I just mentioned, is I always think about the Q&A of a film. So the film is played, I stand up in front of a room of folks who have seen it, and someone asks a question about a choice that I've made. Do I have an answer? Do I have an answer to the choice? Is it meaningful? Is it considered? Have I walked around the choice for long enough to feel okay? If they say, I didn't like that, or that hurt me, or that insulted me, or that didn't consider me, there are worlds in which that response from me is, yeah, I really see how that didn't consider you. Or there's a version of that says, here are the ways that I thought I was considering you, whatever the you means in this, right? And so I feel the same way about the book. I mean, I'm noting, and will continue to think about long after we hang up, your summary of beginning the book and being like, what the hell is going on? And then your end of the book, I understand I'm putting words in your mouth, but the end of the book, which is like, whoa, I kind of get something and I feel like I need to reread. And I will say that you're not the first person to have reflected something like that sentiment to me. And I love it. That makes me feel great. However, I know that there are many people who are going to get to that what the moment and probably put the book down, and so that's, I don't know, that's something that I'm going to have to keep thinking about. that's part of the reason why there's a kind of how this book works section at the top of the book. But I don't think that answers all the questions. In some ways, it might ask more questions. And so yeah, I think this is all related to your question about pushback. And to me, it's related to preparation and research, and to just try to do everything you can in the making, and then to be okay with your choices and to be open to the possibility that you will have missed some things along the way.
So enters into considerations of how to make this book accessible, right,
Yeah.
to a wider audience, because it is a very, like you say, even though you blot out, not blot out, even though you change names or do not refer to specific people necessarily, it is ultimately an extremely personal narrative that you're putting on the page here. And so I'm sure you can say something similar about wanting to make this a book that people are actually going to read, right? And not just your family members,
Yeah.
which is an extremely difficult thing to do. And I'm curious, like what you were thinking of in order to make the personal universal in that sense, not necessarily universal, but more widely read.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, part of that was a kind of real rigorous personal accounting of what was necessary, what
Sure.
parts of
Yeah.
the personal were necessary. And I'd be curious if I really took apart the book and placed all of its anecdotes and its sources alongside the personal narrative, what that balance would be. And my gut is that it's less than half the book, is my gut. Um, and the sort of central figure of the sexual violence in my life is a figure who emerges. Um, and I like your blotted out sort of gesture, but he's referred to as X. And if you think about X as sign and symbol, you can cheekily think like X marks the spot, but you can also think
Yeah.
about X as the kind of like unknown variable, right? And I do think that most people, at least most people in my life, have an X in their history, and I know my mom does, as an example. And so while X is specific to my life, I also wonder if by signifying him in a particular way, there is an opportunity for folks to associate differently. And so that's one of the many, many ways that I attempted to open up, because also it's not really about X. And that's also like the kind of trick, right? Is yes, of course, I'm like reckoning with a history that is real and hard and person specific, but I'm also reckoning with a culture and a structure that enables us and disables us from negotiating and managing and healing and moving through and finding repair. And so that to me is a project I hope for many, and not just for me.
Absolutely. And I like this interpretation of what X refers to as a symbol, right? I was thinking of it. We'll get real nerd hours here, but the under erasure. Who said that? Derrida, right? Jacques Derrida was like a big proponent of that one, where putting a term under erasure is not necessarily eliminating that term or even highlighting that term, but being a odd mix of both, right? Where there's always a trace that remains no matter how much you're actually going to try to erase it, right?
Yes.
There's a palimpsest in a sense to
Yes.
again use that overused perhaps term, but there's always like some kind of trace remaining that has an indelible mark on the
Yes.
paper that you're writing on.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Okay. I'm not crazy. Good.
Oh, love it.
We've been talking about a lot of different aspects here, from trauma to masculinity to media, and what kind of impact do you see Vantage Points having going forward, right? Or where do you see your reckoning of masculinity developing in the future, right? Again, does this? I don't know if this is a fully developed question or as developed of question as it could be, but again, if you want to think of it in more straightforward terms, right? What is the future of trans representation or masculine representation in media, right? Where do we go from here?
It's a really great question, and I feel like I would be a rich person if I had the answer. But I think that there's, a couple different things. So you've mentioned trans narratives and you mentioned masculinity, and so I can maybe speak to both. Not that they're not related, but they're also sometimes not related. when I think about masculinity, one of the things that I try to get to in Vantage Points in the chapter about weapons, is I try to think about like the violence and possibility of looking at oneself, and to think about accountability and complicity and the relationship between those things. And so it's in this point where I'm bringing in the work of someone like John Grayson, who, to give a very small anecdote, was imprisoned in Egypt, and upon his release and return back to Toronto, started running routes using a mapping technology such that that little line, that architected line that gets drawn when a running app is tracking your path, we're creating the profiles, the facial profiles of folks that were still incarcerated. And to me, it's such a stunning and devastating way of thinking about accountability and complicity and the self, right? And so I hope that Vantage Points in some ways can be in conversation with Grayson, or there are many other examples in that chapter. And so that chapter comes really close to the end of the book, and so it's trying to give you a look back, to be like, here are the ways in which we could interpret and or think about the structure of looking at a self, or life writing, or memoir, and all of the problems of all of these categories in a new way. And so that gets me to the answer and or to the thinking about transness, which is also, Vantage Points is a deeply trans book in its methods and its orientations, but also, what does transness mean in the context of a project like this? And then what's possible for trans life writing when we are at a moment when people understand that people have transitioned, people understand that there are medical and socio-legal processes by which you can accomplish said things. And what if that was understood in some way to free us up to different kinds of storytelling that are about trans experience, but that are not about a kind of embodied change over time?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that very in-depth response.
Oh,
I
that's a good
really,
question.
I wasn't expecting. Yeah, I mean, the connection to the weapons chapter is a really interesting one. I wasn't thinking about it in that sense, but I really like that. So I always like to end the interviews I do with one particular question, which is like journalism 101, but I always like it. And that is, what question did I not ask in this interview? And what's the answer to that question?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, don't have a stock answer to your question. Okay, there are two things. I'm not going to overthink it. There are two things that come up that I would like to offer as an answer to your question. One of which is, is there a text or a piece of media that does not exist in Vantage Points that you wish had, or for reasons that you don't understand does not exist? And the answer to that question is yes. There is a book by an author named T. Fleischman called Time is the Thing a Body Moves Through, where the author is reckoning with not only their own personal trans becoming, but also the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres. And it is a striking combination, an example of someone who I think is trying to think through art and aesthetics. And I recognize synergies between what I'm trying to do with McLuhan and what they're trying to do, that for reasons that really befuddle me just didn't end up in the book, but I think about it a lot. And I'm always into an opportunity to boost other people's work in the context of being asked about my own. And then I guess the second question that emerged was maybe a product of the age and stage of where I'm at in press and promotion, which is, what does your mom think about this whole thing?
Yeah.
And I will share a small anecdote, which is to say, I came back home to my mom's house in Toronto recently after the book's publication, and after she was able to get the material object in her hands, because she too read a version of the book pre-design. And it was incredibly exciting to witness my 70-plus-year-old mom attempt to speak out loud about what the design components of the project were doing to her experience of reading something that was about her own life. And it just gave me this boost of never being afraid to take risks, to continue to try to to have these conversations. And, my mom is an avid Google stalker. And so my secret hope is that she finds this podcast conversation and understands that I've chosen to end it by talking about her.
I think that's a absolutely beautiful way to end this, and brings together a lot of what we've just talked about. So, Chase, thank you very, very much for joining me for this conversation. And the book is already out, but it's published by Arsenal Pulp Press, if I remember correctly, right?
That's exactly
So,
right.
and I imagine it's available everywhere if people want to pick it up.
Absolutely.
Great.
It
I
is.
highly encourage people do. In case that wasn't already clear by this interview, I highly encourage people read this. It's fantastic. And yeah, is there anything that you want to plug before we finish today? Is there any social media or anything like that that you want people to, or even upcoming projects, anything like that?
Oh, yeah, I'm easily findable on the internet at
Mhm.
myname.com and other such things. If you live in Toronto, there's a book launch event on November 17th, depending on when this hits the airwaves, and that's about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much for your time, and have a good one.
Thanks, Patrick.